In this section, we're going to be looking at late 19th century Algeria and the Mokhrani Uprising, as well as Algeria as France and Algeria as a settler society. So, when the French come in 1830, it's run by the military, and the military rule is seen in two different ways. It's seen by the settlers as too pro-Arab, as not giving the settlers carte blanche to do whatever they want, despite the fact that they have um, law that favors them. However, from the Algerian perspective, they see the military as the only thing that is allowing them to hold on. So what we see in around 1870 is a move by the French government to go from military rule to civilian rule. And this infuriates the colons and, for different reasons, infuriates um, the Arab population. So enters in Muhammad al-Mokhrani or Bakhshala al-Mokhrani. He's this local leader from the Kabylie, and he calls for a military response. And in March of 1871, so spring of 1871, he calls for a jihad. So it's worth unpacking this word that's common in the United States in the post 9/11 environment as an Islamic holy war. And this is where it's worth looking at what the word means in Arabic and how it's been used historically. And jihad literally translates as struggle. Um, and so there is a lower jihad and a greater jihad. The struggles are to make the world better. So it is a struggle to make the world better. The lower jihad is kind of a conflict, an external conflict to make the world better, to make the world safe, if you will, for the ummah, the community. The greater jihad is the one that's internal, this internal struggle, if you will, of doing the right thing. So jihad used in the West is really just only half of the term, and in fact, the less important of the two terms. But in 1871, March 1871, Mokhrani makes a call, and 150,000 Algerians answer the call for this jihad, and it's rapidly becomes across the entire country. Now, mostly along the coast, right? Because that's where most people are. But the French are really just shocked because this revolution is widespread. So this Mokhrani uprising, we can think of it as a revolution. It is catches the French flat-footed, but by the end of 1871, it's crushed. The French crush it, and there is the reason that it's crushed is there's no Muslim nationwide coordination. There's no central leadership. There's no planning. And it has that going against it. So as a result of this violence, there is a crackdown. This might remind you of the Sepoy Mutiny, the Sepoy Rebellion in 1857 in India. Right, so there's this war in India. It's 15 months long, and the British crackdown. Something similar is happening here, but since the goal for France is not just taking money, which is the case in India, but the case is to take land and to turn it into a settler colony, the French response and crackdown is land seizure, and you have 1.1 million acres of prime arable land that are taken by the French. Sorry, I'm recording this at school, obviously. So 1.1 million acres is almost 2,000 square miles. So it's a massive amount of space. Um, it also leads to widespread destruction of Algerian society. This leads to buildings being destroyed. This leads to Quranic schools being put under surveillance. This leads to leaders being executed. Some leaders are actually sent off to French colonial holdings in the South Pacific, like New Caledonia, so near Australia. And in fact, the Arabic language is categorized as a foreign language. So the Mokhrani revolt is the climax of 31 years of bloodshed that devastated Muslim society. Um, and it leads to there not being any serious political response that can push back against French rule after this point. It leads to physical humiliation, as I mentioned, the seizure of land, the expulsion of leadership, um, the being a foreigner in your own country. Again, we can make connections to indigenous peoples of the United States and Canada, of having their language being banned or not being designated as a foreign language. So this has massive humiliation and psychological devastation, and it leads to Muslim Algerians kind of going to their corner, like retreating into the interior of their society. Um, and we have at this point two increasingly separate societies. Um, and although there are periodic revolts after the Mokhrani uprising, really it isn't for 50 years that the Muslim population actively pushes back. So Islam becomes this, through religion becomes this protected interior, this unconquerable personal private space that French political space can't attack. So it's this internal look, and it is this identity through religion. So let's look at Algeria as France. This photograph here is from Algeria, from this capital city of Algiers. As I mentioned earlier, we have 1.1 million acres of land just as a result of the Mokhrani uprising. So if we were to look, I would recommend pausing this, go look at a map of Google Maps of Algeria and do it on satellite view. And you'll see that although it's the largest country in Africa, overwhelming amount of it is the Sahara Desert, and then you have mountains, but the arable stretch is right along the Mediterranean. So if you're expelled off of that, there's not a lot of other places to go. And we have this massive population boom. So you go from about 25,000 people in the 1830s to after the Mokhrani uprising, it's about 10 times larger than that, 300-ish thousand people. And then by the war in 1954, it's around 1 million, 1.2 million settlers. And these are French, but not only. These are these colons, and you can see it right here, colon. These colons are people of Spanish, Maltese, Italian, French, German, Swiss extraction, but principally French. If we were to look at farming policy, once again, this loss of arable land, farmable land, leads to a collapse of Muslim rural society. And a lot of this land that's being owned now by settlers, these are often what's called absentee landowners. So these are the land is owned by someone who doesn't live there. They're absentee. They live in the city, in the cities of Oran or Algiers, um, but they own this farm. Now, so who works that farm? It's often the dispossessed Algerian peasants who owned it for generations and generations before. So you can imagine you're an Algerian, you're working the same land or adjacent land, but you no longer own it. You're poorly paid, you're highly taxed, and we can obviously make connections to post-Civil War Black Americans. You can make connections to South Africa when we get to that, and we can make connections to Mexico. Very, very similar dynamics of, in this country it was sharecropping, but absentee land ownership. And of course, what does it lead to? It leads to anger. So this farming policy is terrible. Going on to the third bullet point, the colons have power in the French government. They are French citizens. They have sway within the legislature in Paris. And after 1881, Algeria is an integral part of France. What do I mean by that? It's part of the country. It's not a possession, but it is France. So Alaska is the United States. It's not something that we own. It is the United States. Same thing here. We will get to the Native Code Act of 1881 more so when we come closer into the war, but here's the short version. It's a law that only applies to Muslims. It's, in that sense, similar to what we'll see in South Africa. And it's similar to a system that's used elsewhere in the French Empire in Africa. And we can see by the date, very similar, very close in time to the so-called Scramble for Africa, where the French take much of West Africa. So this, basically by saying all you Muslim Algerians are the same, what this does is it cuts across class barriers that already existed within Algerian society, and that led to a unified dissatisfaction across the political spectrum of Algerians, across the class spectrum of Algerians, but created a deeply divided, deeply unequal society in total, right? Colons and Algerians deeply divided, and led to hatred and conflict, and it really was a major cause of the war that we'll look at. What's interesting about this is the settlers develop what's called a siege mentality. A siege mentality is this belief that you are a small amount of people that's surrounded by these growing hordes. We're these isolated pockets, and the threat of violence is always beneath the surface. We can really make clear ties here to white fears of Black Americans in the United States in the 1840s, following Nat Turner, but also up through the present day. This fear that some Americans have of demographic changes in this country is going to lead to an ever-present loss of way of life, a fear that violence is always beneath the surface. So a few things to note here, right? Colons clearly have much more power, much more wealth. They have the laws in their favor. They have political representation. But there is still the fear that we're the minority. They're going to get us. Let's close in now here on this notion of what's called land dispossession. Land dispossession is to take away one's possessions, right? In this case, land. So the simpler term we could use is land theft. We should think of dispossession not as a few bad dudes stealing, but the entire financial and legal system is built for stealing. I'll give you an example of that. Just in terms of loans. So if you were Muslim and somehow you were able to get a bank loan through the French banks, you'd be charged 30% interest. The French are charged 2%. So the ability to get out of debt, the ability to gain wealth is stacked against you by the legal and financial system. We can make connections into this country with redlining and the challenges Black Americans faced with home ownership, which is, as you may know, the number one way Americans gain wealth in this country is by owning a home. Okay, that's the second bullet point. The first bullet point, um, I think one argument or one question could be is like, well, wait a second, the Algerians were ruled by the Ottomans, and now they're just ruled by the French. Either way, these are not them. The Ottomans are based out of Istanbul, which is in Turkey today. So, yeah, foreign rule, but it's not. Ottoman rule did not lead to expropriation of land. Ottoman rule did not lead to an imposition of a new economic and legal system. Ottoman rule did not lead to mass settlement. It did not lead to an attack on indigenous belief systems, of course, Islam. We're talking, just for those of you who know a bit more about Islam, we're talking about Sufi Islam, which is the more mystical tradition rather than Shia or Sunni Islam. So what's the effect of all of this land disposition? What's the effect of this settler society? We have land loss, which we've outlined many times. And this land loss leads to food loss, and this food loss leads to daily agony. And this is the feature of colonization. Humiliation, both physical and psychological. You can't get away from it. You can't get away from it. All right, let's end with some takeaways from this time period. From the invasion in 1830 to the Mokhrani Uprising in 71, we have the destruction or disruption, if you want to say, of Algerian society. We have the reshaping, as I just mentioned, of the political structure from the Ottomans to the French, and it's by design. All of this destruction of Algerian society, politically, socially, economically, it's by French design. And the goal, and if you look through the French records, it's pretty clear. It's not like being hidden. The goal here is to dismantle existing systems and then create new systems that benefit the settlers. That's the goal. In the French records, you can see that that's the goal. And unfortunately, what we see now in French society is, in some parts of French society, is a desire for, oh, well, the schools in France really need to explore how French colonialism benefited Algeria. What were the good things about French colonialism? Well, we can know more both sides French colonialism as, well, it hurt them, but it also helped them. As we can say the same thing about enslavement, helping blacks in our country. But we have this desire for this narrative in the United States, right? Of the kind slave master, that slavery was better than being in Africa. So this narrative, or this desire for this narrative in American public schools, is mirrored today in France. All of this I'm saying is, I know we're talking about France, I know we're talking about Algeria, these far away from home, this is far back in time, but you can make clear and precise links to the United States and public schools in the United States in 2020. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Demographic impact. Algerian population drops by a third in this 40-year period. 1/3 of Algerians' population is smaller. And this is due to the war. This is due to, the war itself, the fighting itself, but also economic disruption. That's land loss, job loss, societal breakdown. It's food shortages, inability to access food in the market, because what we have, and this is similar to what you see in India, but in the Algerian case, a lot of the land is turns into, a significant amount of land turns into wine country, and is being used. The land that was growing Algerian food is now being grown grapes for the French and European markets. So there's not enough food to go around. There is increased death due to disease and malnourishment and forced relocations. So this has devastating demographic impact. The third key takeaway for this time period is that French leadership across the political spectrum supports colonization. This is not a partisan issue. There is a partisan difference in what um, colonization should look like, but everybody's on board. Widespread view on board is that colonization is a good thing. And the last thing I want to leave with is something that we've mentioned multiple times before in this class, and therefore it's important because it's coming up again and again, is that colonization is a structure built. It's not an event that occurs. It's not like, oh, there was this battle, colonization, or there was this one king, colonization. It's structure. What I mean by that is these laws, these are norms, these are common sense ways of being in the world that are enforced through laws. It's being codified or codified, made it by code. Through French law and policies, we have citizenship for settlers, we have bank policy, we have land being taken because people who have lived on there for time immemorial don't have French documentation that they own the land. So this power inequality is built into society, and it's fully in place by the end of the Mokhrani Uprising in 1871, if not earlier in 1848. But by this point, 41 years of French occupation, it's on lock. It's there. Okay. Next time we come back, we're looking at the impact of World War I on Algeria.